It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this series and to today's presentation by Ambassador Frank Wisner. He's currently an international affairs advisor at Squire Patton Boggs. As we look over his career, it seems as though he's been assigned every crisis zone that the U.S. has had to pay attention to over the last 40 years. His diplomatic career spans 4 decades, 8 American presidents. He served as American ambassador 4 different times to Zambia, to Egypt, to the Philippines, and to India. In addition to his role as ambassador, he served 2 critically important roles in Washington as Undersecretary of Defense and also for policy, and also as Undersecretary of State for International Security Affairs. Any one of those appointments would be a career for many Foreign Service officers. It's a great tribute to Ambassador Wisner that he's had those 2 high-level appointments, as well as 4 ambassadorships as well to critical countries of importance. Going back a bit, after graduating from Princeton University in 1961, he joined the State Department, so you see 4 decades of work. His first posting was in Algiers, immediately after the independence of that country from France. He then went to another hotspot, to Vietnam. We all will remember that, where he spent 4 years at the apex of the war. He worked as a senior diplomat as well in Tunisia, in Bangladesh, then came back to Washington after that as Director of Plans and Management in the Bureau of Public Affairs at the State Department. He joined the President's Interagency Task Force on Indochina, not getting far away from Vietnam, the entity responsible for evacuating and settling nearly 1 million refugees, where he served as the Deputy Director. He was the Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs from 1982 to 1986, during an intense time of diplomatic activity for Southern Africa. And then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice appointed Ambassador Wisner as the nation's special representative to the Kosovo Status Talks in 2005. So you see he's covering one hotspot after another, a remarkable career by now that's included Algeria, Vietnam, Southern Africa, Kosovo, India, and Egypt, and now finally Berkeley. Given that experience, I think he's ready for anything you throw at him, but I'll turn the floor over now to Ambassador Frank Wisner.
Neil, thank you. Neil, thank you very much. And traveling from the East Coast here yesterday, I managed to pick up a bit of a cold, so if my voice falls off, I hope that someone in the back of the room will put their hand up, and then I'll try to get it, recover what I can and continue on. So do let me know. Neil, thank you very much. Thank you for the privilege of being here with the Institute of International Studies. Thank you for the privilege of the audience today. Thank you particularly for the privilege of being able to walk through the campus and to visit sites of extraordinary historical significance, facts that shaped our modern age, to see where Dr. Oppenheimer stood and where the beginnings of plutonium in our lives, just quite shaking. But I have to also say thank you for a flattering introduction, perhaps excessive in the detail of my life and career, and overly flattering in terms of the nice things you had to say about me. A number of years ago, I served as ambassador in Zambia, Southern Africa, and at that moment there was a particular crisis between the United States and Zambia over a matter of espionage. These things happen even among gentlemen, and I was asked to try to go reset the relationship with Kenneth Kaunda, the president, and to do that and help me, I accompanied quite an extraordinary American, Dick Walters, General Walters. General Walters, who had started out his life in the American Army in liaison with the Brazilian division in the Italian campaign in World War II, and went on to be Eisenhower's interpreter and deputy director of CIA. At this point was in the State Department, and spent his life sort of solving really particularly tough and thorny problems. So we went to see Kaunda, and we spent an evening. sorting things out. And I remember Dick Walters looked at Kenneth Kaunda on behalf of President Reagan and described Reagan's extraordinary regard for Kaunda, that he was a man of historic significance in the emergence of Africa as a set of independent nations, a great friend of the United States, a strategic force for logic. And on he went, and I noticed Kaunda was just beginning to melt. At the end of it, we walked out. We'd shook hands. The crisis was over. Kaunda admitted all was forgiven. And we walked out in the corridor, and Dick Walters turned to me and he said, "Frank," he said, "how did I do?" I said, "You did damn well. I really congratulate you, but you laid it on very thick." "Ah," said Dick Walters, "you're a young enough man. I have a lesson of diplomacy to teach you. Those who do not appreciate flattery have never had any." So I appreciate what you had to say about me today. It remains etched in my mind, the value of flattery. I won't try to flatter you today. Instead, I'm going to talk to you about the challenges I think all of us face, our nation faces, as we think about the Middle East. We do it at a time of uncommon crisis in the region, a time in which the policies that we have known throughout our lives have been upended. Nearly half a century of understandings have been tossed on their ear, particularly understandings that guided the United States after we largely displaced the Soviet Union in the wake of the 1973 war. We also do it at a time not only of crisis in the region, but at a time when there is a lot of national debate about, national and international debate about American power. Have we lost, or are we standing at a moment of diminished national power and our ability to shape the world, facts in the world we live in? I happen, by the way, not to be a member of the America Declinist school. I believe that we have extraordinary power as a nation. By any historic standard, it's not only our military strength, but our political, economic power that makes us unique among nations today. But at the same time, power is about perception. And the perception of the relative decline of American power is very, very deep. And I suspect it's going to be a primary feature in our upcoming presidential campaign. That said, I will argue today from a different vantage point that the United States in the Middle East today, we have to begin to rethink very carefully where we've been. For I believe that a number of the policies we've pursued in recent years have led us to some very profound errors. I believe in two regards these errors are telling. Our overuse of military means to try to shape directions and purposes in the world, in the Middle East. We are at a time instead when we need to rely much more heavily on serious strategy, statecraft, diplomacy, backed by military power, but the latter only being used in the most sparing manner. The second set of views that we must eschew, because they have led us in the wrong direction, is where we have chosen to take abstract goals and tried to translate them into platforms from which policy could be pursued. I have particularly in mind the strong advocacy of democracy. And I believe not that I don't profoundly share all of our views about the wisdom and value of democracy, but I question its value as a framework within which you can define and project national interest, particularly in the short and medium term, in a region of as much volatility as we see in the Middle East. Where we are today, in the fifth year of a great crisis, euphemistically called the Arab Spring, a tidal wave of revolution that has swept aside governments in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and Yemen, imperiling others, the Syrians, the Bahrainis, of course the Iraqis, and forcing just about every other nation in the Middle Eastern region, from Morocco right through, to fundamentally reconsider political options and take steps to adjust positions. The spring it has not been, nor, in fact, did it begin in 2010 or 2011. It began, by any reasonable assessment, in the 1920s, when Arab nations first emerged from the shadow of the Ottoman Empire, and more often than not within borders and led by institutions shaped by Europeans. In these early years, however, Arabs began to try to come to terms with a modern world and find their identity within it, to search for modern values and principles, to struggle between secular and religious tendencies in their own historical experience, all with a single-minded view to restore the greatness of Arab civilization, a civilization that had so profoundly shaped world history and our own emergence in our Western world of the intellectual, scientific traditions that we have come to appreciate. And finally, to escape from the heavy hand of repressive regimes, even when those regimes in the Middle East came disguised in the clothing of Arab nationalism or in the name of an anti-Zionist struggle. The crisis didn't just therefore begin a long time ago. It was sharpened in 1990s, 1997, particularly at the time of the Iranian Revolution, in which one strong and significant minority community, the Shia, began, having taken the example of Iran's reassertion of national importance, to challenge the established majoritarian Sunni orders in much of the Middle East. And at the same time, in leading that challenge, Iran moved to challenge the influence of the United States in the region and our key allies in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and to produce on its own a rejectionist front, which included others like Syria, which would intensify the struggle with Israel and also the marginalization of American power. These are the facts that led us to where we stand today. But I will argue with you that we as Americans too often face the events of 2010 and 11 with some facile assumptions. Facile assumptions, I argue, that persist today and are extremely dangerous. That the revolutionary outbursts that occurred in the Arab world should lead to democratic outcomes, much as the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 led to a reemergence of democratic experiences in Eastern Europe, as if somehow democracy was the natural successor to autocracy and tyranny, and the failure to achieve democracy was a perversion of what is the right and progressive order of the world. I believe very deeply we could not have been more mistaken, for the Middle East is neither this country nor is it Europe. And instead of democracy emerging from the events of 2010 and 11, we've seen two basic trends emerge. One is straight out flat chaos, and the second is the rise of Islamic radicalism and violent Islamic radicalism in particular. The last 5 years in the Middle East have been a struggle between order and chaos, and a fight over the role of political Islam, beginning with the Muslim Brotherhood's experience in Egypt, moving on to Al-Qaeda, and then on to, as I will use the term, not ISIS or ISIL, but Daesh, the expression used throughout the region, the current crisis that we face in Iraq and Syria. This struggle has taken the form of a battle for stability in states like Egypt, where the overwhelming majority of Egyptians have sought to reestablish some order in their lives after a period that they regard as an existential threat to their own existence and a period of chaos from which they wish to look back and not ahead to. And civil wars, a second emergence of crisis, which you experience and see today engulfing Syria, Libya, Iraq, and Yemen, civil wars that will not end anytime soon. And sectarian struggles, another feature of chaos in Bahrain and Iraq. And we're seeing furthermore, still to be appreciated in its full impact, massive population shifts, not only inside of countries, but across borders. For example, and particularly, I worry, and all of us should, about the stability of Jordan and Lebanon. In Lebanon today, where fully 30% of the population are now Syrian refugees with very little to guarantee any form of livelihood, education, even correct levels of medical treatment and education. But even more serious in a different sense is the fact that the Syrian refugees are Sunni. And in the Lebanese equation that all of you know so well, these balances between Christian, Sunni, and Shia are the very nature of the Lebanese political order. And without that order, there is no easy way to predict what will happen in that very sensitive country. So this crisis, it's years in making, will not be over anytime soon. It's a fact we've got to get used to, that we're in for a long haul, and it's not going to be easy to work our way through it. Because we have, as Americans, profound interests that are at stake. I recall the rather facile, silly ideas expressed the other day by Sarah Palin, who argued that, quote, we should let Allah go sort it out. How stupid. After all, it's simply not possible in this vitally sensitive region where global security and the prosperity, economic prosperity of the world derives much of its base, particularly for Europe, that depends on the energy supplies that flow from the region, but also is immediate victim to refugee flows, as we're beginning to see flood across the Mediterranean or come through Turkey and the Balkans. Europe is particularly vulnerable, so is Asia, as we think about oil and the world economy. The recovery and sustainment of economic recovery requires a flow of energy resources, which the Middle East will remain, shale oil undertakings in this country notwithstanding, the heart of the energy future of the modern global economy. And then we have, in our own interests as well, we have defined the security of the State of Israel as an essential national commitment, not just an interest, a deep commitment of the United States. And we can't just walk away from Israel. But if we think we could walk away from the region, think about terror. And how would we ever get our hands on the sources of the most obvious forms of terror if we were not involved in the region, didn't understand what was going on inside it, in touch with local police and intelligence authorities, working with allies to try to control the phenomena that we're facing today with the radical elements, notably Al-Qaeda and Daesh. And finally, to all of you, particularly in a university as great as this one is, to think about the history of the world. No great nation has ever seen its interests stand the test of time without a strong stake in the Middle East. It has acted throughout history as a center of the globe intellectually, in religious traditions, in the geostrategic dimension. Well, let's think for a moment. I remember, probably many of you do as well, as we all read our Russian revolutions, that when contemplating the revolutionary conditions in Russia, Lenin asked the famous question, what is to be done? Well, I'm going to try to give you 9 answers to what needs to be done if you will bear with me. The first is that we have to understand and appreciate that our past perceptions and our policies were not attuned to the present times, that our assumptions have been called into question, that democracy is one as a natural outcome of the region's revolutions is at best premature, and that judging and acting on judgments about our standards can be a very dangerous way to pursue national interests in this particular region. Second, that, and flowing from it, is that the United States needs to define very clearly and precisely its objectives. Pick those that you have a reasonable chance of accomplishing, and not mislead yourself into vague and abstract goals, the pursuit of democracy being one, that will only lead to your disappointment, the alienation of American public opinion, and a desire to disengage from a seemingly intractable set of problems. And I therefore believe that arguments like those advanced by George W. Bush and pursued under this administration in favor of, quote, a freedom agenda is not a stable platform for our interests. Third, our greatest problem in the Middle East today is chaos. And the opposite, stability, needs to be the core pursuit of American foreign policy with a pinch of dynamism in it. You can't just freeze the order in the name of chaos, ending chaos, but aim for modest changes in political systems, modest outcomes that will give both stability and a chance to create change inside a constitutional structure. We need, fourth, to cement our ties to old friends and make sure those ties remain in good order. I have in mind particularly Saudi Arabia, where the recent elevation of Salman to the monarchy, but the fascinating selection of the next generation of Saudi kings has taken place and gives us a chance of seeing stable leadership of the GCC and the Gulf nations. Egypt as well, where very gradually we're beginning to see the emergence of a stable order and a chance for Egypt to resume her influence and be an ally to us in our desire to destroy Daesh to the east and bring some outcome in Libya that is less chaotic than the one we face. My fifth argument to all of you today is we must be single-minded in our determination to destroy Daesh, but to do it in a manner that means that we're not going to face the next Daesh. If we had Jabhat Nusra, al-Qaeda, now Daesh, what comes next? But that the way to destroy Daesh is not only a military outcome, it must be pursued with fundamentally political means. Governments in the region that represent the varieties of ethnic and religious factors that exist inside of individual countries, an agreement among the outside players, the Turkeys, the Saudi Arabias, the Egypts, the Irans, to allow Syria and Iraq to evolve on their own without deep external meddling. That the political fight against Daesh also has to be a fight done on the airwaves and with religious messaging. Fights that we have a great deal of trouble undertaking and give insufficient priority to the importance of gatherings as the one that will take place shortly in Al-Azhar in Egypt, of imams from across the region to try to counter the religious messages that the so-called caliphate of Daesh is propagating. And propaganda, the airwaves, the language, the idiom of the region, we don't speak, but nations need to come together with our encouragement. And as well, I would argue, deep intelligence coordination between nations of the region and ourselves Intelligence is the lifeblood of a successful successful campaign. These areas taken together do not mean there isn't a military dimension. There is, but it is the last step and the one that has to be used with the greatest care, particularly where it involves the use of American force, which can, if not carefully defined, destroy what you're trying to do politically, which is your best way of overcoming the problem of these radical groups. My sixth argument with you is look at Syria and Iraq, and look at them in almost the classic sense of what's good for the goose is also good for the gander. If it is important in Iraq to create a government of national unity that brings Kurds and Sunni and Shia together, and the government in Baghdad today is doing a remarkable job, gradually reconstituting a military capability among the Iraqis, and then moving gradually and carefully with American military assistance and the regional backing of the powers around Iraq. That's the right direction. It won't happen quickly, but I'd like to think in the next 6 months you will see the political gains, the military gains of Daesh being reversed. And I believe if it's good for Iraq, that's the same outcome we should be pursuing in Syria. And we are not there yet. In Syria, we need a negotiated political understanding. And that will take a coalescence of views between ourselves, the Russians and the Iranians, that takes into account the Saudis, the Turks, and the Qataris. Without a political understanding between the several of us, there is no way to achieve a coalition in Syria that will confront Jabhat Nusra and Daesh. It begins, therefore, with a core understanding about what the roadmap is on the part of this country, Russia, and Iran, as tough as that is to contemplate. But I believe it is possible, for Russia is able to pursue different policies along its western frontier than it pursues in its southern frontiers. And Iran, I can assure you from personal experience, the Iranians do not believe chaos in Syria serves any interest that they know. We need to be clear. Attempts to announce the ends of regimes, as Obama did with regard to Bashar al-Assad, were unwise and extremes. We need to have the parties in Syria come back together in Geneva, achieve a ceasefire among themselves, and turn their energies loose on the ISIS's, the Daesh's, and the Jabhat Nusras, welding a transitional government that would even include at the beginning the Ba'ath elements of the Assad regime, a grace period, a constitutional convention, elections that would settle matters among Syrians, but leaving Syria sovereign, its territory integral, a unitary form of government with a federal dispensation, with a sharply diminished presidency. All ideas that have currency, but need to come together if they are to work. And so getting Syria and Iraq right means getting the politics of both in order. 7, I believe we have to focus on the reemergence of a regional balance of power in which the United States can play a role to help protect its own interests and shape the future of the region. And that will only happen if we and the Iranians are able to reach a nuclear agreement in the next weeks at the discussions that occur in Geneva and in Vienna, where I have reason to be modestly optimistic that we and the Iranians can reach such an agreement, given the fact that largely we have found common ground on the core issue of inspections, on what will happen to facilities in Fordow and Arak, and we are now wrestling with the exact definition of the amount of enriched uranium and how much would be produced in the future, and how, on the other hand, we will get our hands around the diminishment of sanctions. But we need Iran to be part of the region. And we need to be able to deal with Iran inside that region. Until we have a nuclear agreement, neither we nor Iran can deal with each other with the confidence that's necessary to begin to construct a system of a balance of power in which American interests will be best served, for we will be able to maneuver and help assure the security of a region by bringing our weight to bear selectively on each of the region's great crises. We have to be able to deal with all parties. But let's remember, as we go into an intense national debate over the value of a nuclear agreement with Iran, that we have sought for now 30 years to bring sufficient pressure to bear on Iran so that it would reach a diplomatic, negotiated settlement. And we're on the way to getting it. Not on the way to destroying Iran, it's not to be destroyed, but to find a set of common principles that will make it possible to avert a nuclear weapon and open the door to greater regional cooperation. That's what's at stake, and what's really at stake is the emergence of a balance of power. And I argue, eighth, that don't forget Yemen and Libya. They seem remote to American interests, but they have the full capacity to poison North Africa and the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, and both have to be attended to with the same principles of political settlements achieved by negotiations among parties. We have to be, number 9, very careful about Libya, about Tunisia and Egypt, and make certain that we resource in a careful way both experiences to reinforce stability, to make certain that the political structures are revived and are able to deal with the enormous economic challenges both countries face. Not just with American resources, but our ability to bring together the World Bank, the IMF, the European Union, and the nations of the Gulf, which we have much experience and are able to do if we put our mind to it. And finally, 10th, I would argue with each of you that forgetting about the Israeli-Palestine problem is a profound mistake the United States must avoid. For while the achievement of an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians is as remote today as I've known it throughout my life, it is equally compelling that the United States be involved in trying to achieve it. If we are not involved, then we are involved, but only on the side of one party, and we pay a political price as the result of our unique bias. Ladies and gentlemen, I've had a lot to say to you today, but let me close with a few broader reflections that I'd like to leave with you as a result of my years, and a number of them have been, as Neil has described, of reading of history, as many of you have done. And I hearken to all of you, if you have a moment, to pick up and read Henry Kissinger's latest work on world order. It's a fascinating description of the challenge of power of nations in our times and how to navigate the stormy seas that we face. I think we are, and all of us would agree, living in a time of dramatic change. The old orders that we grew up with and became used to are disappearing, and the new ones haven't fully emerged. It will take years before we know what will be the order of this world and how nations will deal with one another and how we will manage the huge cross currents of issues like climate change and global population moves, other of the major issues that emerge as we enter into this new century. But I also believe that there isn't any disengagement possible. We can't just pack our bag and stay here on our side of the Atlantic and the Pacific and not be involved. We are a world power. What happens to our friends and allies and what happens to the global economy affects us every day in the way we live. Third, I urge all of us to call to task our leadership, to think strategically, to plan and to act after careful reflection on strategy. Strategy is not an extension of politics and positions. It's carefully constructed views on where you are, where you're going, and how you get there. And it proceeds from ability to overcome a particularly unfortunate American problem called strategic amnesia, in which we forget why we took positions in the world and then didn't realize why they remained as constantly true as when we first entered into them. I would also argue with you that getting it right between great powers is enormously important if you are to achieve stability. That the balance of power in the world at large is important today as it was when it was first defined in the Treaty of Westphalia. But we must recognize as well that it doesn't answer the questions of a revolutionary era, and we are in one today. And so flexibility is an important additional argument. I believe firmly that you have to, in this country, keep military strength, but only to use it in a last resort. To deploy our intelligence, our diplomatic resources, is the first line of national defense, with military choices being left for a later stage in any crisis. We have to think, finally, that this is a world in which peace and some degree of stability and the projection of national interest will be accomplished only when we find common ground with others, develop coalitions. We'll use the habits of negotiation to make sure the best possible outcomes are achieved. And that we remember, finally, that peace is never final. It's a constant quest. And in that, our best interests will be served. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been very kind and listened to my thoughts, and I'd be happy if you have any questions to try to take them on. Thank you, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. That's a very all-encompassing look at this very problematic area. I'll turn to the floor for questions, but also I preface this by saying our usual habit is to have a small reception after the formal agenda is completed. So after our questions and answers, if your question isn't answered, if we don't get to it, or if you want to pursue it more thoroughly, you can do that directly with Frank after the session. And for those of you who want to discuss this or other issues, a glass of wine sometimes helps to lubricate thinking and energies. So with that said, let me start by asking my colleague Daniel Sargent to offer the first question. And I will bring the microphone to you so that, again, for our recording purposes, your question is heard.
For posterity.
Daniel, do me a favor. I know you're a colleague of Neil's, but tell me very briefly who you are.
I teach in the history department.
Excellent.
And I've done some work on Kissinger recently, so I was particularly interested by what I inferred to be the Kissingerian character of the solution that you envisage. You used the word argue a number of times in your presentation, and I'll say that I have no argument with the solution that you envisage. What I do have, however, is a question about its political viability in the United States. And I'd be grateful to hear you speak more to the political viability of the kind of, realistic and pragmatic accommodation with regional powers that you envisage. To put simply, I'm skeptical that a credible presidential candidate for 2016 could envisage the kind of pragmatic political solution for Syria that you describe. To put it simply, I'm skeptical that a presidential candidate for 2016 could envisage making the kind of accommodation with Iran that you envisage, and which I concur is necessary in order for regional stability to be achieved. So the question is whether practical regional stabilization is within the realm of the political possible in Washington.
Very, very important, good question. I'm reminded about our great democracy, the expression that Churchill used, that we arrive at the right outcome after exhausting all the alternatives. I'd like to think that when you put your finger on a couple of the practical points you've made, that there is a logical outcome in Syria and in our relationships with Iran, and that gradually it's coming clear that we have to deal with these issues with a different perspective than has been easy for us to define in the past. Let me start with Syria. The idea that this monstrous government of Mr. Assad's needed to end there is no quarrel with that. But the question was not whether the Assad government should end, but how it could be brought to an end. And then more recently, how do you deal with the violence and the success of the radical religious forces, Jabhat Nusra and Daesh, that have taken root in Syria? Are you going to accomplish that objective by simply declaiming against the regime in Damascus? Rather, you need to think strategy. And the strategy, as I tried to outline, is very carefully to bring Syrians together around a negotiating table with pressures to bear on them from Russia, on the government, and on the Iranians, both of whom have made it absolutely clear that they believe in the end Assad is not part of the solution, but he goes with the outcome. He's not the beginning of the solution. For if you remove the president, his structure, his military forces up front, you have chaos. If you forge a coalition between ourselves, Saudis, Turks, already very difficult to do, and the Russians and the Iranians to bring the parties together, then you have a coherent way to begin to attack the radicals and create a political space in which the longer-term solution should have a chance to work. As the Iranian foreign minister has told me, he said, I can imagine an outcome in which the Syrian president has powers comparable to the Queen of England. And I said, Mr. Minister, this, in Syria's case, may not be quite the outcome, but darn close. You need to think strategically and politically. And I know that it's hard, given the water over the dam, the facile nature of our political dialogue, to say down with this and up with that. Yet, really, we have to now recognize, and I believe we do at heart, that to defeat Daesh and the consequential threat to our own security, the region in Europe, you've got to come at it in a different way. I believe similarly the case is true for Iran, that while the logic of our policy will lead us back to the kind of not cooperative, but parallel actions with Iran that we've known in the past 30 years ago, we're still not intellectually there. But wait till you have a measure of confidence, confidence born of a working agreement. Can one be achieved? Let's look at the last year, the interim agreement that was negotiated between the Iranians and the P5+1 on controlling the nuclear problem in Iran has worked perfectly over 12 months and gives you an indication that you can build that out into a regime in which Iran has civil nuclear capability, and we are not faced, the world isn't faced, with an Iranian nuclear threat. As that becomes true, and if our political space will give a chance for the logical outcome for our policies over 30 years, we'll have a chance to forge a different tie with Iran. But let me warn you, if we're not careful, if the Congress loses its way, if Bibi Netanyahu's speech before the Congress stirs up the nest of hornets that he would like to stir up, then what's the outcome? What's the alternative to a negotiated agreement with Iran? A negotiated agreement, by definition, achieved between the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, and Germany and Iran is going to be a good agreement. Nobody's going to sign a bad agreement. A good agreement means you avoid the greatest risk to ourselves is a war, another war in the Middle East. And if you don't have a nuclear agreement, you're on a war track again.
I had a question up front.
Hi, I'm Steve Harris. I'm a chemist. I work at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, but I was interested.
Good for you.
So I'm trying to think about this idea that we're going to try and defeat Daesh. It seems to me it really matters how popular it is. On the one hand, I hear, oh, this is a perversion of Islam. It's only the radical 0.1%. On the other hand, I see polls that 20, 30, 50% of the population supports what they do. Where's the truth?
Where's the truth? We are at an ugly stage, not only in the region, but among Arab, principally Muslim communities, even outside in Europe, and occasionally less so in this country. A sense of humiliation, somebody standing up for your rights, and these movements have a flash in the pan attractiveness to them, but sufficient that young men and women will get on a plane and fly to Turkey and creep across the border into Syria or Iraq or wherever they go. So I'm not being trivial about it, but I tend to think this is a fad based on some very deep-seated problems that we could spend an afternoon talking about. But I also believe that Daesh can be beaten, or I wouldn't stand before you today with the list I gave you. I believe it can be beaten because, like radical groups of this sort, they survive only if they advance. They have no inherent capacity to govern. They cannot produce education and water and health and economics. They have to take the next village, much like Genghis Khan's hordes, and they do it with a very similar technique that Genghis Khan would have appreciated. They horrify the audience they're about to hit with acts of grotesque brutality aimed at intimidating their adversaries. But who are they at heart? There are a variety of components. It's not a monolithic group, Daesh. It's a mixture of alienated army officers from the old Saddam army, Sunni, used to run the Iraqi army and the Iraqi nation. It is a group of Sunni tribes who were marginalized and mistreated during the Maliki years in Iraq, or by the Ba'ath regime in Syria, representing alienated Sunni opinion. The third element is, the third element is broader Sunni opinion, people who feel that the Shia have gotten the better of them and that this is a perversion in the order the apostates have taken over the Vatican. I think these elements of the Daesh coalition can be defeated, can be divided and defeated, provided that there is a concerted effort, coordinated between ourselves, the local governments, the Saudis, the Turks, very hard to get right now, the Iranians. You can begin to isolate Syria and Iraq and then decompose. And as you decompose, you confront militarily and you target the leadership of Daesh for destruction, I think they can be defeated. I'm prepared to stand before you today and say that I think even if we're sloppy in our execution, and we will be, after all, why do we take a general and put him in charge of a political campaign? I believe that in the next year or so, you're going to see Daesh retired from the front ranks of a major threat. But what I'm more concerned about is that if we don't do it right, and the region doesn't come together to do it right, we'll face a Daesh with another name and another similar but different set of principles.
I think you've implicitly made. Oh yes, Louis Stalinsky. I'm a journalist. I think you've implicitly made a great argument against the toppling of Saddam, but that's not my question. My question is, surely Iran wants more than the end of sanctions, and I'm guessing you know what that is. So can you tell us?
Well, I think Iran does, and it's one of the reasons I have some modest hope that we can get an agreement and the agreement will stick. And what Iran wants at heart, from now 14 years of meeting the Iranians and talking with them till I'm practically blue in the face, is an understanding on the part of the regime that rules Iran today and will rule it for years to come, that they cannot survive as a nation in isolation. They can't produce the jobs, the economic future that they need for their younger populations and their present population if they're not part of the international trading, financial, technological systems. That they need to get back inside the world, and they're prepared to compromise on several very important matters: on their role in the region, on their ability to project a kind of defiant nuclear attitude, and the third is to set aside the aspirations of the founding fathers of the Iranian Revolution, the Khomeini generation of people who believed that somehow there was a messianic message afoot in the principles that they pursued when Shah was toppled in '79. These three critical compromises are inherent in the way that both the supreme leader is willing to live with and the Rouhani government is willing to pursue. You will hear many times, maybe Rouhani wants an agreement, but what about that supreme leader? I can only tell you what Iranians tell me. Supreme leader is a very shrewd man. And in effect, he has said to his nuclear negotiators, if you get an agreement, that's good for me. If you don't, it's bad for you. That he will support the government in pursuit of the agreement, but he will not take a position on the agreement itself, and thereby have, like many political leaders, both sides of the argument.
Thank you for your comments. My name is David Beatty. I'm a Berkeley resident, an old student of Hans Morgenthau, so I understand balance of power. So my question is, with regard to that, without being naive and expecting democracy to pop up from the Arab Spring, we can also get, as we often have in the past, supporting regimes which you might call either repressive, but whatever, don't really fulfill the aspirations of the people in the Middle East in their attempt to get better educated, etc. How do we walk that kind of line between stability on the one hand? Yeah.
It's one of the toughest problems in the minds of Americans and in American foreign policy. How do you tread that line between the pursuit of national interest and your deep commitment to the ideals of a better and more democratic world, because we believe that, by definition, is better. And I personally believe it very deeply. The point that I have found practically as a representative of my country in nations in this region is you can always aim to be on the side of the achievement of a spread of democracy. And by democracy, I mean the broad set of principles that undergird democracy. You can aim for that without being trapped in the illusion that it can be achieved immediately with short-term gestures or by American actions taken alone, particularly American actions brought to bear under pressure. I don't like what you're doing in your courts or in your arrests of your opponents, but now I will cut off my ties to you, has never, in my experience, produced the change in the other man's behavior, but has tended to drive him to protect his assets, that if you carry out that debate, not from the podium of the State Department press office or the White House, but you carry it out quietly in capitals, and you work to build institutions over the long run, judicial, press, religious institutions that reflect tolerance, political parties, carefully, even if they seem obtuse in their character and form, in the long run, the arc of history is in our favor. But it cannot be achieved by finger wagging or pressure. It has to be done on a consensual basis. And I think all of us would agree that the failure to achieve political change on a consensual basis means that change itself will not be stable.
I don't want Frank on his first visit to Berkeley to think the only questions we take are from the left. So I'm looking to the right, and we have a question over here.
Yeah, I'm Mark Goldstein, a resident of Oakland. Given that, going back to Iran, given that they have paid such a severe price for their nuclear program to date in terms of being ostracized, in terms of economic sanctions, and they have so much energy, fossil fuel-based energy, why do you think they really don't want a nuclear weapon, and the world should really believe that? It seems to, in my mind, it seems to run contrary to their actions over a long time.
Well, there are two answers to that. The first, I think, is important. Don't believe it. You don't have to believe it. They're not even asking us to believe it. What you need to do is negotiate constraints with Iran that make the achievement of a nuclear weapon impossible or virtually impossible by any normal ability of a nation to achieve it. And I think we're in range of getting it. We have a lot of enemies here, and we got a lot of enemies in Iran of the same deal. Sometimes I think we're mirror images of each other. But I do not say you take the Iranians at their word and trust. It's got to be verify and make absolutely certain what you're verifying is clear and that there is no breakout path to a nuclear weapon. That's critical. And I think the elements of the agreement, as I understand they're emerging, give us precisely that. So don't believe it. But second, I think you can take a look at Iran and look at a system analytically. We have a lot of trouble doing this. It's 30 years since Americans have been able to freely mix with Iranians. How many departments of Iranian studies exist in American universities? How many PhDs can be written today? How many scholars can analyze and assess what's going on? But we need to open the doors of communications to better understand and use our influence. Where I am convinced of what I'm about to say to you, I really am deeply convinced of it, and that is the United States has not been able to check and roll back the Iranian Revolution, and we are not going to be able to do that. But nor have we been able to stop it from its pursuit of its own interests. So is there not another way of opening communications dialogue with the Iranian government and pick and choose those areas we can oppose and those areas we can... Does that leave our friends in Saudi Arabia or Israel any worse off? To the contrary, it's the best chance they have to find trade-offs with Iran, because we would be in the midst of the trade-offs. Now think about it for a moment. Where do we and Iran have common interests? In Afghanistan. The preservation of Ashraf Ghani's and Abdullah's government is as important to Tehran as it is to Washington. The success of Abadi's government in Iraq, the success of the Iraqi armed forces resuscitation and the Kurds is as important to Iran as it is to us. In Syria, the Iranians do not believe a civil war can be won. It can only be compromised, which is at heart what I think our view should be. The Iranians find the most dangerous element is radical Sunni expressions, Daesh being, and guess what? So do we. So are there platforms in which we and Iran can think and act? I believe there are. Not perfectly, and not always in agreement. We will disagree sharply on the state of Israel. That doesn't mean that in the trade-off, Israeli security is not potentially enhanced. So I'm arguing, let's look at this packet differently than we have in the past and put ourselves in a position where we can maneuver the pieces in a way we haven't been able to for decades.
I thought I came to sit on the left side. I'm Purushottam Bilimori. I'm a visiting scholar here at the Institute. Not far from the area of crisis is Pakistan, which of course has a hand in Afghanistan through certain of the forces that are rife in some stable, some growth state. But it's an unstable region in itself, and it has nuclear capabilities. Next door is India, which also has nuclear capabilities. And in the recent agreements that have been signed, as I understand, there isn't a very clear undertaking by India that it would not use its nuclear potentials towards capabilities, arsenal capabilities. So it's not getting uranium from Australia. No clear agreement has been written about whether this will be entirely for civil use or whether it could be. The Republic Day celebration showed India's powerful missiles and so forth. And of course, there's China that needs to be contained, so we are told. India is interested in protecting Indian Ocean and so forth. So how is it that Pakistan is allowed to be where it is, and India could grow in nuclear proliferation, one might put it that way? Not quite sure. It's not very clear. But I just came back from India, and I know that the intellectuals there are very worried. The Gandhians are very worried that India could be on a path to advanced nuclearization, whilst
I guess I have a little bit different perception of where India is and where India is headed than your question would imply. I don't see a difference between the nuclear defense doctrine being pursued by the Modi government and its predecessors and the original BJP government, under which Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government, under which the nuclear tests first took place. India believes in a nuclear deterrent, not a nuclear warfighting capability. And that is particularly true of China, and with Pakistan it is also true. So I just don't think that doctrine is going to change. India may build out some capabilities to give it assurance that it can deploy a nuclear capability if that ever happens. If you told me that there are plans afoot to create a submarine launch platform for an Indian nuclear weapon, I couldn't disagree with you. But I don't think that changes the core idea that India's in a deterrent mode, not a planned warfighting mode. Pakistan represents a very different set of issues. And the principal concern that I would have with Pakistan is less the nuclear capability, and I'll let Neil, who's very smart about these things, knows a great deal, tell you the degree of confidence he has in the Pakistani military's ability to protect its nuclear holdings. But what has bothered me about the Pakistani nuclear capability is, as it proved to be the case in Kargil, that Pakistan, under the shield of a nuclear umbrella, could feel that it could test the conventional ground. That's very dangerous. And also, with the progressive decline, the coherence of the Pakistani state, looking out over 10 years, in whose hands eventually do these weapons exist? So Pakistan is a dilemma for me in security terms, nuclear security terms. It's very, very real. And we don't have a grip on it. But I know one thing is true, is that the debate in Washington will start the day after the last American soldier leaves Afghanistan, that we look at the serial lies and misrepresentations of the Pakistani government and say, we're out of there. And we cannot be. We must remain involved in Pakistan. We must try to the best of our ability, however frustrating it is, to stay in touch, create conditions of cooperation and influence with the Pakistani government.
I'm Larry Berman, a psychologist and alumnus of this university. I have some question about the role of Iran, because even prior to the nuclear development of Iran, Iran was engaging in a lot of aggressive activity in the Middle East, and whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah, and in some ways I see the conflict between the Shia and the Sunni. They're both radical forces, but I see Iran as being the radical form of Shia, destabilizing the region. Maybe you can address that.
I think it's a fair concern, a fair observation, but let me try in some ways to address it, and I don't have a perfect answer. I think the state that you assert, a revolutionary, exporting revolution, not just because of Shia doctrine, but because Iranians saw themselves as the classic nation under threat. All through the 19th century and into this century, invaded by foreigners. My father's generation tossing out Iranian prime ministers and restoring foreign influence in Iran. Iran has a real historic sense of paranoia, very deeply felt, and not entirely without historical justification. Much is the same sense that we've all come to appreciate about China and the serial victimization of China, or that Indians feel when they look back at the sweep of their history, that maintaining the independence of India from foreign pressure. Iranians have not their idea of creating a bulwark of defense is inherent in the notion of the rejectionist front that they created. It has a Shia component and has a national security component. Today, those two elements exist. Iran is a vigorous, open, participatory, argumentative society. And you can read virtually any opinion you want in the multiple newspapers that cover Tehran's streets. But I think the core view of Iran's leadership, and particularly this government, Rouhani's government, is, as I tried to describe it earlier, to readjust Iran's position in the world so that Iran can get on with its modernization, its economic commerce, its flows of financial and technological, to grow the Iranian nation. Now, in the end, is that going to mean more or less meddling with Hamas? Hamas is probably a bit of the past story. Hezbollah is a different matter. And Iran's rather obtuse relationship with the State of Israel. I am prepared to argue with you that when it comes to Israel and Iran, the Iranians understand Israel has the capacity to literally destroy Iran if Iran's objectives are to destroy Israel. Now, how that becomes operational, I'd like to think we can play a role, and it's one of the reasons I argue for getting beyond the nuclear agreement and creating political conditions in which we can begin to jockey for influence in the way Tehran perceives the rest of the region.
My name's James Shin. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and thank you, Ambassador Wisner, for your very incisive presentation. I have a three-part question. You can answer as few or as many of them as you wish. The first is the situation in Egypt. We seem to see, perhaps in President Sisi, a return of the same situation that we had under Mubarak. And so I'd be interested in your analysis of why is this different now, and why won't we face the Arab Spring all over again, or whatever you want to call it, in Egypt and in the ensuing months. Second question is one that relates to the Bush administration and the Iraq War. The military did a highly professional job of prosecuting the military part of the war. But the occupation was a disaster. And my question is how such an amateurish operation, and I say that having been a colleague of some of the people involved in that operation, but how structurally that came about in the execution of American foreign policy, and so that we don't have a repetition of that. There's something really inherently weak in our system that could have happened. The third question is, for the Obama administration, we have what seems to be a sort of policy in terms of military power and the application of it, of leading from behind and late. For example, in Libya, we eventually used military power, but that same increment of military power applied early on could have obviated the problem that we have now of the militias having captured arsenals that otherwise there might have been some control over. And we see the same thing with Daesh now in Iraq, finally moving with military force, but moving late and having to pay a much higher price as a result. Thank you very much.
Jim, first of all, I'm really glad to see you, and all of you in this room should know what a terrific record of service you achieved for this country. You've asked 3 questions. They're all important. They're all vexing. Let me start with the last and go to the first. I disagree with the way we went about Libya. I had no problem with the use of American military support, and particularly American military support, in conjunction with the French and the British to stop Gaddafi from destroying his opponents in Benghazi. But it was at that point that my agreement ended. And I believed when he was on his back feet and realized he could not spread his power, was the chance to try, on the behalf of the Arab League or the African Union, to create some interim arrangement in which elements of that ghastly system called the Iraqi government and military forces and the rebels in Benghazi could have found at least a modus vivendi for a while, and you built then on that structure. Instead, the pursuit of a military objective, the destruction of the Gaddafi regime, meant the country had nothing at the end, no structures. It was already a weak political establishment, but it had nothing except today 80-some militias, and some of them call themselves Libya Dawn, and some of them call themselves in support of the legitimate government, but they're not. Neither coalition is stable, and it is a nightmare trying to put these pieces back together again. So the answer was not military at the beginning. The military purpose was to stop Gaddafi from destroying opposition elements and force him to begin to make the concessions that would permit a different outcome. I believe in this circumstance and in many others was the right way to think about the problem. And yet I think in a very facile way, we came to believe if we hammer a problem militarily, it will end. But we do need to recall that virtually every military solution creates other problems, and that if your strategic logic is imperfect and you don't predict those, you're going to face chaos. And that's exactly what we have in Libya. So I haven't really answered your question about Libya today, except I honestly believe it's going to take, the UN can carry the stick. The Egyptian idea was not really serious about getting a peacekeeping force that would go in and clean Libya up. You've got to come up with some structure, and that's what is being sought. It's what the North Africans want. It's where we ought to be backing it. But you'd like to find somebody in Washington who's paying attention to Libya today, and I believe that very few people are, and that is a serious mistake. We'll pay a price.
Frank, if I could take the chair's prerogative, and I feel a little bit like at Halloween, you're only allowed to take one treat at a time.
Oh, okay.
And so given that I'm thirsty and others may be as well, if you could pursue other parts of your question with Ambassador Wisner afterwards, and for those of you who would like to hear that answer, you can do that with him as well.
I was itching to answer the Mubarak Sisi question, but go ahead.
I defer to my guest.
I think I'll leave aside the analysis of the Washington scene. We're all distressed about that. Distressed about our assumptions and the techniques we deploy. This was a wretched decision, and it was none of the rules that I remember from the United States government of proper deliberation, before the use of national power occurred, and we ended up in a squalid mess we're going to pay the price for many years. But as to Sisi and Mubarak, it's very common today to pick up most American publications and see the kind of Sisi, Mubarak, we've gone back to the future argument. I think it's flawed. I see the situation in Egypt actually quite differently. My starting point I began to address earlier by saying the overwhelming majority of Egyptians went on the streets because they believed they were faced with an existential challenge. They believed that the Muslim Brothers meant chaos in their personal lives and an abridgment of their own sense of modernity, and millions of people stepped on the streets. They found common cause with the military, the police, and the bureaucracy, and that was the end of the Muslim Brothers. I never believed the Muslim Brothers represented more than about 15, 18%, but that's still a pretty large percent. So let me come back to that in a moment. The Sisi government, in its iterations, took hold, and it set out a roadmap. Many of us have forgotten there was a roadmap of elections, constitutions, and there's still one critically important election to go, and that is the parliamentary election. All of those steps are departures from the practice under Mubarak. But the core difference in Egypt today is the sense that Sisi has personally and those around him that they live with the sufferance of the majority of Egyptians, that they do not have full license. They've got to restore order, but they can't run the country under a regime of pressure and pressure only. And that they have to move decisively to change the way Egypt is operating. Best example, the decision to dismantle the energy subsidies, probably the greatest decision taken economically in the history of Egyptian governance, one that Mubarak never dared go near. Now, I believe that repression, a degree of repression, is a part of the Egyptian system and is popularly welcomed for the moment. But if it goes on too long, the welcome will wear thin. And that another sentiment in Egyptian life will gradually reassert itself. And that is, how do we live with others in our community? The expression in Egypt is one hand. It's not just about Christians. Is that Egyptians treat each other as if they're part of a family. It is in heart unlike a Libya. It's a stable society. So how you begin to reincorporate those who are in violent political opposition as the Muslim Brothers, I think it'll take a while. I will tell you, I don't believe it'll take place as long as this generation of Muslim Brother leaders are running the show in their own group. That they have to accept the need to participate in a democratic system, just as the government needs to open the doors in the opposite direction. So I predict in the near run, Egypt will send that signal that it's a society of repression, but I believe that it's moving towards stability, and therefore the chances of it breaking out of this pattern that it's in right now, which is welcomed by the people, is winding down, and Egypt's having to face its real problems, which is how it deals with its economy. Wait till mid-March and you will see the Egyptians unveil a number of economic policies that I would have prayed were possible in the Mubarak years and never were. And so don't write off Egypt, but particularly remember, we have had a relationship with that country since 1973. It is a pillar of our influence in the region. And before we follow these habits of cutting aid for this and cutting aid for that, remember what kind of region we're dealing with. And who are our friends? And how are we going to create coalitions if we're at war with key components? So I constantly ask Senator Leahy, let up a little bit. We have bigger fish to fry. Thanks.
I'm afraid we need to leave some questions unstated on the floor, but I encourage you to come to talk with Ambassador Wisner afterwards.
I'd like that very much.
We're going to have a reception now. There'll be some wine, some cheese. Please avail yourself of that. Have a snack. The students especially, I know you're always hungry. And let's give Frank one last thanks.